Thanks for everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. So much to talk about. Read the book and you'll get more of the details. I can't go into everything. Everyone has a copy of the book there. I brought copies for everyone. Just take one of those packets on your way out and you get a free copy of the book. The title is The Evolution of an Evolutionist, and the subtitle is From Evolved to Devolved, and you'll see what I mean. Basically, my story is I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware. From Wilmington to Wilmington, like he said. And I grew up a very secular life, didn't go to church, never really heard almost anything about God at all. My parents had grown up religious, but they just departed from the church for various reasons, and so we just kind of existed. And really, from my standpoint, pretty much what I saw around me for most of my life that's what I saw. People weren't talking about these things, people weren't reading the Bible, and God was absent and irrelevant and really unknowable and really something you didn't even think about. It wasn't even a topic that you heard anyone mentioning. And this continued all the way through from grade school. You know, I wrote a paper on Lucy, the missing link in evolution, supposedly a skeleton that proved the link between the primates developing over millions of years into man. And then, of course, you go to the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. as a little kid, and you see the display there with the dinosaurs in the millions of years, and then the picture of the ape slowly coming upright to stand upright and become a person. So, as you're a kid and you go and you see that museum, you're going to believe it. You're not going to question it. Of course, you're taught these things in science class also. And it really didn't even bother me. I went to the zoo and, hey, there's my uncle, and, I was happy with it. I kind of acted silly anyway, so I figured, maybe it's true. I really did come from these guys. And then went on to medical school, and, you'd think in medical school that if there was even any chance of intelligent design or anything, when you're studying the human body and that's your full attention with what you're studying, that, they might mention something, but they don't. And so really, silence isn't neutrality, and that silence is a strong witness to your heart of what reality is, what's important, and what's not. So all those years of silence and all those years of the other had me convinced that evolution was true. And let me define what I mean by that when I say that. That means that by random chance occurrences over millions of years, nothing evolved into us. Right? You go from Big Bang to chemicals to a primordial soup into smaller life forms and more increasing life forms. Some people call it from the goo to the zoo to you. But that's what I believed. Now, that's fine, but you reach a point in life, and I saw some things along the way that I questioned. The first thing that hit me was when I was in cellular molecular biology at the University of Delaware. We were studying a very simple gene, the Lac Operon. It's for a lactobacillus, and it's a gene that regulates different things about it. It was just one little gene regulation system, but it was so complex and so intricate, and there were so many factors involved in just this one gene and so many parts that were interdependent of one another. In other words, if you didn't have the whole system, it didn't work. So it didn't seem like it could sequentially evolve, and it just spelled design. So I went to the professor, I'm in college, but this was bugging me, and I said, hey, wait a minute. I said, this just doesn't seem like it's possible. How could this come about by random chance, just all on its own? And he says, that's a good question. We don't know, but it did. And so I believed it. And you don't really question these things. Now, when I was older and I kind of did everything I was supposed to do. I went to medical school. I got good grades. I went to Duke and was chief resident in dermatology, had my practice, and had a family, beautiful wife, kids, picket fence, a good source of income. Everything was great. But I was still, kind of empty in my heart. Things weren't fulfilled. It wasn't what I thought it would be. You spend all that time pining away, chasing to get there. If I just keep studying and just keep getting there and I get that job or I get, to that point, then I'll be happy. But I really wasn't. And some things were lurking in my mind that are related to this. You know, when you tuck your kids in bed at night, the worldview that I was taught basically says that they are nothing more than highly evolved chemicals and random chance matter, and that when they're gone, they're gone. And all of your family memories and all of your vacations and trips and everything, they cease to exist the moment that you die. And that sucks, quite honestly, to be blunt. And that really bothered me. So, you know, I was busy taking pictures, taking videos, trying to capture these moments because I wanted to be able to relive them. And when we died, I didn't want them to cease to exist. And it didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense that the love that I had for my family and kids was just basically meaningless, except for me. It didn't make sense to me. And it didn't make sense to me why do people die? I mean, maybe a basic question. You're kind of taught that people die. But if we're so highly evolved, why in the world do we store up all these memories, have these wonderful moments, and then just die? Why is there death? Why does death seem wrong? When someone dies, if it's the natural order of things, and there's nothing after death, and that's it, and we're just highly evolved chemicals, there's no more, why when someone dies do we grieve? Why does it seem like it's not right and it's not supposed to be this way? Why is there in your heart the desire for eternity? Right? There's never enough time. It doesn't matter if they've lived 80 years or not. When you say goodbye, it's difficult. And there was something in me that says there's something wrong. And it seemed to me that society was getting more and more evil. I mean, there's just people murdering their parents, stuff that never happened when I was a kid, and it was worse than when my parents were kids. And it just didn't make sense. Life was frustrating. I just had a sense that there was something wrong with this world, but I didn't know what it was. So, you know, I had this thought in cellular molecular biology, and then I started to just reevaluate things a little bit. I started to question some things. And part of this was before I started reading the Bible and stuff, which I'll get to in a second. But I thought, you know, just the simple fact of how does life come from non-life? Abiogenesis is the technical term. At a university, I can throw some of these out there, right? There's no answer for that. No one had an answer for that. And the real kicker for me, and I went back to my professor later when we got to DNA, was that DNA is an information storage system. In fact, there's 3 billion base pairs of DNA. There are 10 times 12 to the bits of information in the DNA. That's a lot. That's equivalent to several volumes of an Encyclopedia Britannica. And it is the most complex information storage system that we know of. Now, here's the catcher. This is what really bugged at me, is that information does not evolve. Information is always put into the system by someone from the outside. You can't have increasing amounts of information put there. Plus, there is a code. The DNA is a code. It's a triplet code, right? There's the 4 base pairs, and depending what code is, it's basically a series of letters. This thing goes along and reads the code and tells you what that code means, and it tells you what amino acid to put in the protein chain. Okay? It's encoded. Anything encoded is information from an outside source. It can't evolve on its own. And even more than that is that the decoder for the DNA code is encoded on the code. So there's no way to get the decoder built. You have to read the code to build the decoder to decode it. Well, my professor said, well, we don't know how any of that happened. Why is there a repair system for DNA if mutations are important? There's a lot of these questions that no one brings this up. You've got to ask yourself, and no one tells you to ask these things. But there are things with DNA that basically was really shattering my view that it can't be this way. But there's more. You know, I was taught as a kid that the Darwin's finches, that the finches, you know, they changed their beaks, and that was evolution. But wait a minute. They were still birds. They didn't evolve into anything different. And all that Darwin was showing was sorting of genetic information and speciation. You've got to have a completely different set of events to increase complexity and have an increasing amount of information to go from a finch to an ape or a human or something like that. That doesn't explain that at all. In fact, what happens is when those finches are selected, you have a loss of genetic information, not an increasing amount. The bird that dies, that genetic information is lost. So there's no way to explain going from the finches to the goo to the zoo to you. In fact, they're unrelated, but yet that was presented to me as that's the proof. So I said, this just doesn't make sense. What else bothered me? How about a moral consciousness? How, when I did something wrong, did I know immediately that it was wrong? So let's say, for example, I lie or steal something. When you do that, there's something inside of you that immediately says you feel guilty. You know you did something wrong, right? Now, if you're just organic chemicals, how could those chemicals know what you did? And certainly, how could they know that it was wrong? And on what basis is there for it to be wrong? Right? If there is nothing at all except chemicals that are highly evolved, there's no basis for right and wrong. And certainly, how could those chemicals know? How could that explain the love that I have for my kids that I'd be willing to die for them for? Where is that coming from? So there were a lot of questions that did not make any sense. Now, all that's going on, all that's turning in my mind, and I basically picked up the Bible mad at Christians because we lived in a neighborhood and they were excluding us because we were, heathens or whatever. And we were a little heathen, I'll give you that. But it certainly didn't make me want to be a believer. In fact, it made me the opposite. I went to the Christian bookstore angry to buy a Bible to prove that they were wrong and that they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. Put on a disguise because I didn't want to be seen in the Christian bookstore. I just wasn't the kind of guy who would go in there. And people weren't reading the Bible, so I wasn't going to be seen with one. So I had to get a PC Bible. You can read about all this in the book. But the interesting thing was that I began to find things that began to answer all these questions. And it answered them in a way that made sense, and nobody else that I ever heard had the answer. Now, then there was a red flag that went up, when I started looking at the stuff and says, wait a minute, the stuff you're reading and studying, isn't it unscientific? Because, I've written scientific papers, I did scientific research, I published in scientific journals. When I was in medical school, some of them were first author in circulation research. And so there was just this thing nagging at me saying, oh, wait a minute, where are you going and what basis are you going to know what you're talking about? So I just began to think about it, and wait a minute, what is science? What is the science that I did? And that's the field where you make observations and you use the scientific method to observe things in the present and make some kind of statement about why those things happen and what's the likelihood that they would happen again. But somehow I found that the term science, by the time, in the context that I had been taught it, in addition to that, had a label on it, or actually a built-in prejudice where anything that has anything to do outside of everything happening on its own is excluded as unscientific. But I found that there was no basis to say that. In fact, that whole thing saying something wasn't scientific was its own bias that says nothing exists except what we can observe naturally. And I looked at the human body and said, wait a minute, this thing's so complex that if there is something more, right, then maybe what seems natural isn't so natural and happening on its own. So there were a lot of problems with this idea of science labeling on me, and so what I found out was that science is really a philosophy of naturalism. It's been used to denigrate any type of investigation of something that doesn't happen naturally. And it's its own philosophy. And that was important for me to discover, because then I felt like, okay, I'm free to do this. I'm not becoming a non-scientist, because science has nothing to do with investigating miracles or things outside of science or things like God. It's not meant to. It's not supposed to. So you can't say it's unscientific because it doesn't have anything to do with science. And I just wanted you guys to understand that, because, you know, if I say I can't see the invisible man so he doesn't exist, it's circular reasoning. And so then I felt free, okay, I can investigate this stuff. I'm not throwing away my intelligence. I'm not taking some blind leap of faith. So anyway, the things that struck me in reading the Bible were that, wow, the Bible said, many people said that we're not highly evolved, we're devolved. Oh yeah, that man was created in perfection by God and he is fallen. That there's something wrong with us, wrong with our hearts. We're prone to sin. We're prone to lie and cheat and do all of these things. All those things rung true to me. I want to do what's right, but I can't. I want to change. I can't. There's something wrong with me. I want to be different, and I can't do it. That humans are born separated from God. That death came from sin. That the reason people die is because man fell from God and we're a fallen creation and that's why we die. But the reason that we have eternity in our hearts is we're created in the image of God. And so death hurts and is wrong because it's not supposed to be this way. Well, I'll tell you what, that rung true to me. I didn't necessarily believe it, but now I had an answer for what seemed to me like a world with increasing evil and why people die, and it's all related. That there's something wrong with us. We're not highly evolved, we're devolved. Fascinating. Well, what else? Consciousness is from a moral soul or spirit. Man isn't just a physical body. Oh no. Think of it as hardware and software, right? You have the hardware of a computer. That's the physical housing that the software manifests itself from or through to a physical world. But the two are interrelated. They're intertwined, right? If you take the software out of your PC, the PC is dead. It won't turn on. But the real life of the computer is the software. And so the Bible was saying that, hey, man is physical, but he's spiritual too. And it's that spiritual person in there that tells you the sense of right and wrong, that convicts you when you steal, that gives you the desire to not want to die and to know that there's something wrong with it, that has love for people, that was willing to die for people that are in your family. No one else ever had an explanation. Again, I didn't necessarily believe it, but I had an answer that made sense. Things look designed because they are. Imagine that. Gosh. So all this is churning in me, and then you have, you know, Christ come on the scene in the New Testament. I didn't know anything. But I had looked at all the different religions and everything, and I instantly knew, hey, there's something completely different about this. No religion has someone coming in person, in the flesh, saying, I'm God, and I have the answer, and I am the answer. And that I've come to rescue you from this fallen, sin-ridden world so that you can have eternal life. You're not supposed to die. You weren't created to be this way. And I can give you the power now, while you're here on earth, to at least get better and overcome some of this stuff. I needed all of it. I wanted all of it. Didn't care that I was being religious or whatever. I knew that if this were true, it's certainly what I needed. But I had to find out, okay, is it really true? I mean, if it's just a bunch of religious gobbledygook to make ourselves feel better, then forget it. I don't want to go to church on Sunday morning and sit in a building if that's all we're doing. But if there's a reality to it, I want to know. And everything rang true. I can't emphasize that enough. I had the worldview presented in the Bible fit with reality. And I couldn't find anyone else who had those answers. I mean, people would say, well, why would a God of love allow evil in the world? Why is it like this? Well, if you read what the Bible says, God didn't create it that way, and He's not going to let it stay that way. Man does it. We're doing it. And yet he can still work good through evil despite evil. And he came and suffered it and experienced it himself. He didn't remove himself from it. No, he took on more evil than we could probably ever imagine as personally. He came and experienced it himself. Wow. But was it believable? So the first thing you've got to do is, I'm reading this and I'm getting all these facts and stuff. What's the historical reliability of this? How do we know that what's in here is true? How can we trust it? How do we know just religious people didn't make it up? Well, if you use, looking at the New Testament, the criteria we would use to evaluate any ancient history at all, be it Caesar or the Iliad or any of these different ancient things that we study in history class, I was shocked to find that the historical attestation from manuscript evidence of the scriptures blows away anything else from ancient history by leaps and bounds. It's not even close. The number of manuscripts you have, how closely written they were to the events that happened. 25,000 to 600 at its best. 25,000 for the New Testament, 600 for the Iliad. The New Testament manuscripts within 50 to several hundred years versus 500, 600, 700 for everything else. In other words, if you're going to throw out this, just based upon that same criteria, playing fair, you've got to throw out all of ancient history. Well, wow, why didn't someone tell me that? Why is it so heavily weighted towards this? What's up with that? Other religions have books and everything. Not even on the map, guys, in terms of their books and their historical reliability using a secular historical standard. So I was suspicious. I'm like, wait a minute, this is just doesn't seem to make sense to me. I smelled a rat. I took an online class for a religion class on the New Testament. We have here in North Carolina one of the premier New Testament scholars in the world at UNC Chapel Hill. And I took his online class about the New Testament. And he basically shreds it. Yeah. And so I was like, wow, maybe I'm not on the right path after listening to him. He's in Chapel Hill, but anyway, he made a statement in his class, and he says that Jesus never claimed to be God. Now look, I was not a believer, guys, and I really didn't want to become a Christian for all the social stuff that went with it. I thought I'd be, kind of a geeky party pooper or something. I don't know what I thought. And I don't like wearing suits and all that stuff. Of course, all the other stuff was good, but I knew as an unbeliever that statement wasn't true. It was obvious that he demonstrated himself to be God. They tried to kill him because he claimed to be God. And I said, okay, there's something funny. So I began to do more research and find out that this guy was very slanted in what he was teaching. And that the things that he was picking apart at the scriptures, many of them he's giving you half of the information and not all of it. In fact, a very biased look. So I looked at it plainly, and I said, okay, here we have God in the flesh, supposedly, saying he's dying for me to save me from my sins, to give me hope of eternal life. Sound good to me? I mean, what's wrong with that? What negative thing can you find if you know you've done wrong and you don't want to die? There isn't anything negative about it, guys. There's nothing. It's just, can you believe it? So I had the historical evidence here, and I looked at the resurrection, and that was the clincher. I looked at what's the likelihood that actually happened. And the more I searched, the more I looked for any other plausible explanation. There weren't any. The way God set that up, the only conclusion I could reach was that he really raised from the dead. The Apostle Paul, he is the persecutor of the church, killing Christians. What in the world makes that guy turn around to become the greatest proclaimer of Christ that ever lived, when he has nothing to gain, everything to lose? How do you explain it? If the apostles made it up, that's not going to convince Paul. Paul was persecuted and almost killed. In fact, one time he was left for dead. All the apostles died for what they believed in. people blow themselves up today, but the difference is they think that they know the truth when they really don't. These guys were eyewitnesses. They would have known that they were dying for a lie, and people don't do that. So I'm like, okay, I intellectually believe. I can go to church, and I thought that what happens is that God sees, okay, he believes, he puts a little mark on you, and then when you die, you go to heaven, and that's it. You try and be a good boy and this kind of stuff. In the meantime, I didn't know there was anything more to that than it. And what happens in the book is that basically about a week later, I had kind of a meltdown event where I basically apologized to God for all my sins and asked him to change me and all this stuff. And it was late at night, and I wake up the next day a different person. And that's the only way to explain it, and I go into it in great detail in the book. I thought differently. I felt differently. Bad stuff was immediately removed. I was a big four-letter word person, and all that was just gone from my vocabulary. I scared my wife. She didn't really know who I was, and so all this, but I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know there was something that when you become a Christian, it's not an intellectual acceptance, it's a spiritual transformation, that something happens to the very nature of your existence, that there's proof that actually becomes to live inside of you. Incredible. I mean, you go from evolution to that, you're like, wow. So I was freaked out. And the premise of the book is that I try to figure out what in the world has happened to me. And I go back and analyze it and found out that what happened to me and what I had experienced was exactly described in the scriptures. So that was obviously an eye-opening, time for me. And so since then, as about 10 years ago, I've done my best to follow the Lord and have him do what he would have me to do. And basically my deal is I tell people what happened to me, because I know there's lots of people who have been indoctrinated into evolution, that have been thought that you can't believe in God, it's unscientific, or all this stuff, and it's all so slanted against the truth. Romans says the truth is suppressed in righteousness. That word suppress means to intentionally steer away in the wrong direction, against the wind, against the current. And I found the more I've researched that that's exactly what's going on. And it's sad because, the Lord is so personal, so interested in the details of my life. It is amazing. Let me give you one example. I collect rare Bibles, and some from the 1600s and on, and some are replicas, some are real. So a man came in the office about a year ago now, and he says, hey, I have this Bible here, and I bought it 30 years ago at a flea market for $15, and it's been in my closet, and I never read it, and I don't use it, and I know you collect here, you take it. So I'm like, hey, wow, that's neat. And I've had other people give me some Bibles and stuff before. So I looked at it, and I opened it up, and it turned to the title page, and I knew, I wasn't an expert or anything, but I knew enough, and it said, the Holy Bible, Old and New Testaments, amendments to the language by Noah Webster, who wrote Webster's Dictionary. Well, he published his own Bible, first edition in 1833, and he went on to publish several others. Well, the Noah Webster Bible is exceedingly rare. I mean, you almost can't even find one, let alone a first edition in absolute mint condition. Value $15,000 to $20,000 easy. Is that a random chance event? Now you think about that, right? This is God doing something that really has no significance at all, giving a gift to me. I mean, who am I? He has the guy buy it 30 years ago when I'm an unbeliever, knowing that he'll give it to me and keep it. I mean, you just start thinking this through when you're like, wow. When we moved into our office, oh, and by the way, I did have to go and tell the guy it was worth 15 or 20 grand. I said, Lord, I don't want to tell him. I don't want to give it back. Don't make me tell him. I told him, but the guy was very wealthy. He didn't care. He said, you keep it. Anyway, when we moved in our office, let me give you one more example. When you we have a replica of the King James Bible there. 1611, one of the biggest books ever made. It's huge. It's amazing. And when you buy the replica, you get one page from a real one, because they have old ones that are, falling apart and they only have part of it, but some of the pages are still good. So they take those pages, make a stack, and when people buy it, they'll give them, as part of it, a real page. At random, right? You know what page we got? Anyone want to venture a guess? This is crazy. Leviticus chapter 14, the chapter on skin disease. Again, another seemingly insignificant thing, but if God is willing to do that, just to show you, I'm here, I care about you, this new business you're opening, I'm with you, because we had followed him to come down here and all that, that's another story. Guys, he is in everything in the details of the things that really matter. So I tell people that to encourage them, that if you don't know the Lord really personally, letting him into the details of your lives, you're missing it. I don't understand everything. I don't have things like this happen all the time, but that's the way he operates. He isn't far away. He is in the details.